Let's play a game. The game is called Plato or the Bible. Here's how the game works. I'm going to read you a passage, and you have to guess whether it's from the Greek philosopher Plato or from the Hebrew and Christian scriptures. Ready? Here's the passage. The just man will be whipped, he'll be racked, he'll be bound, he'll have both his eyes burned out, and at the end, when he has undergone every sort of evil, he'll be crucified. If you guessed that that was a passage from the Gospels or the Hebrew Bible, you guessed wrong. If you guessed that that was from Plato, great Greek philosopher of the 4th century BC, you guessed right. This is Book 2 of the Republic, which is one of Plato's masterworks on political philosophy. We are working through it on Young Heretics book by book. So a while back, we did Book 1. Now we have moved on to Book 2, which is kind of where the whole project really gets going. Book 1 is like a prelude or a setup, and we talked about how in it, the sophist Thrasymachus gets thoroughly spanked, kind of raises this relativist argument that justice and good and evil are just the will of the stronger imposed upon the weaker. And Socrates exposes him as sort of incoherent and ignorant. He freaks out, and he is dismissed from the conversation. But then in Book 2, Glaucon and Adeimantus, who are brothers of one another and of Plato, sons of Ariston, they say, we're not satisfied, even though we can see that Thrasymachus was kind of a hack. We still don't think that this problem has really been addressed, the problem of what justice is and whether it's actually any good to be just. And so they are going to do what's called, in modern terms, steel manning the argument. So a straw man, obviously, is when you're in your thought bubble on Twitter and everybody agrees with you and you just talk about, oh, those guys out there, the evil leftists or whatever, they believe this. And that, of course, doesn't help because then you make up this weak version of the argument and you don't learn how to convince people. And Glaucon and Adeimantus want an answer to the strong version of what you might call the anti-justice argument, the argument that it's actually bad to be just. Justice is just a convention that the weak impose on the strong, or that we kind of muddle through together with this convention so that we can build society. But really, it's the best thing is to be unjust. That's what they're going to argue in this second book of the Republic. So just to recap, right, this book is composed somewhere around 380 BC. And it looks back to a time when Socrates, kind of grandfather or godfather of Western philosophy, was still alive before the great catastrophe that Athens underwent when it lost the Peloponnesian War. When it lost to Sparta, its rival in that war, Sparta installed a kind of oligarchic pro-Spartan government, a kind of puppet government called the 30 Tyrants. And the 30 Tyrants were brutal. They exiled and they murdered people whom they suspected of being insufficiently sympathetic to their regime. They cracked down in horrendous ways. And they were led, among other people, by this guy Critias, who had been a student of Socrates. So after the 30 were deposed, they were deposed by exiles who had fled Athens and came back, deposed the 30. And Socrates was suddenly under suspicion because he hadn't been sent away. He hadn't been exiled. So it was suspected that he had collaborated with the 30. And this was the occasion of what, in Plato's view, was perhaps the greatest injustice done by the Athenian state in his lifetime. I really believe that this was a seminal moment in Plato's life, that he was always looking back on it and wrestling with it. The fact that the Athenian state executed Socrates, the man who, in Plato's view and in the view of history, really was this incredible visionary genius. He was killed by the state, who are supposed to be executors of justice, whom we are supposed to trust to enforce justice, to know what justice is. The leaders are supposed to be the people who know what justice is. And when they so brutally miscarried justice, Plato was racked, I believe, with questions about how this could be and what real justice looks like. So, when Thrasymachus, or in this book too, Glaucon and Adeimantus, when they raise these questions about whether, the justice really is worth anything at all, whether it's all just hypocrisy, I don't think that we should view it as just like, oh, this is like some dumb, stupid thing that people say, and now Socrates is going to destroy it with facts and logic. Like, it's not that at all. It's actually, I think, Plato raising the strongest concerns that he can and venting his own anxieties about the fact that justice is not always done in the world, to try and figure out what there is in justice that is objective and true. And the reason I read that passage at the beginning is because ultimately, when you carry these questions far enough, these questions of justice, you ultimately arrive not just at questions of how cities do justice or injustice, but what justice is in the cosmic sense and the ultimate sense, a kind of theological sense. The word for this is theodicy, and it's a Greek rooted word that comes from theos, God, and dike, justice. And this is a question that every civilization has had to pose in a serious way at some point in its history. Given that terrible things happen in the world, how can we believe in the objectivity, the reality of justice? Or, to put it even more strongly, how can we believe that God is just when there is evil, when bad things happen, and so forth? This is a question that, as I say, everybody has to reckon with. If you haven't had to grapple with it yet in your own personal life, I regret to inform you that you will. We all come up against it. And unlike a lot of our kind of modern interpreters, or unlike just people in general who are sometimes tempted to wish this question away, Socrates and Glaucon and Adeimantus face it head on. So let's get into the setup here, and then we'll talk about how Socrates answers some of these questions. This is the first episode that I've recorded from my new house that I bought with my fiance, and it is packed to the gills with public goods stuff. It looks so good in my kitchen. This is an online store where you can get all kinds of amazing basics. You can trust that they don't have weird additives or chemicals or whatever gross stuff you might get at the grocery store. Plus, like I said, the packaging is amazing. It's really good aesthetic. They have everything. I mean, I love to talk about their chocolate-covered almonds and all those snacks that they make, like ramen and stuff. Is all really good. But they also make toilet paper and shampoo and coffee. My cat, Chad Cat, really likes their cat treats, which are called freeze-dried duck nibs. And mostly I just like to say that every time I get the opportunity. They have this incredible deal. If you go to publicgoods.com/heretics or use the code heretics at checkout, you can get $15 off your first public goods order with no minimum purchase. So that's literally free stuff. Like, you could spend $10 and get it all for free, right? Publicgoods.com, publicgoods.com/heretics, or use the offer code heretics to get $15 off your first order with no minimum purchase. Okay. So Glaucon starts out by saying, look, there are certain kinds of things that are just good in themselves, that we just love for their own sake, like health. Everybody just likes health. It's obviously good. And then there are other kinds of things that we do for the sake of something else. They're not good in themselves, like drudge work, right? But we get something out of them, like we get wages, for example. And he's asking whether justice is like that, whether it's just something that people do because they get rewarded for it. And this is the argument that he poses. He says, this isn't just something I'm making up. This is how a lot of people view the question. A lot of sophists, maybe a lot of people in Athens who are talking around these questions, right? And so this is something we have to take seriously. It's almost like the beginning or a proto version of what in Aristotle would become the indoxic method. And that's a method in which you take the doxa, the opinion of people in general and philosophers who've gone before you, then you show how that doxa is wrong, how that opinion maybe falls short or doesn't quite describe the whole thing, and you kind of make corrections to it, or you rehabilitate it, right? So here's Glaucon presenting the kind of general idea that people have when they question whether justice is real. Glaucon says, they say, that is people, when they make this argument, they say that doing injustice is naturally good and suffering injustice bad, but that the bad in suffering injustice far exceeds the good in doing it, so that when they do injustice to one another and suffer it and taste of both, it seems profitable to those who are not able to escape the one and choose the other to set down a compact among themselves, neither to do injustice nor to suffer it. And from there, they begin to set down their own laws and compacts and to name what the law commands lawful, and just. And this, then, is the genesis and being of justice. It is a mean between what is best, doing injustice without paying the penalty, and what is worst, suffering injustice without being able to avenge oneself. So this is kind of the beginnings of what we would call social contract or social compact theory, which is this theory about how civilizations and societies form. Why is it that we get together and make rules about our life together? And this version of it, there's a lot of different versions of social contract theory, a lot of different answers to that question. But this version of it is sort of like the version that much, much later Thomas Hobbes would give, which is that what's really the law of the state of nature, just people without any sort of civilization. The law is just you just take what you want, right? And you do violence to people to get it, and you steal and you rape and you pillage or whatever. And Glaucon is saying, that's actually, in this version of the argument, that's actually good. Like what's good is strength and acquisition and wealth, right? And vigor and just taking what you want. But when that happens, when you enter into that dog eat dog world, you might also get attacked by somebody who's stronger than you. And so you make yourself vulnerable to suffering injustice, which is bad. And so you have to make some kind of compromise. And what you do is you make rules so that the majority of people don't have to suffer injustice. It's not the best thing, which would be for just everybody who's strong to grab what they can get, but it keeps people from tearing each other apart. This is kind of related to something that is very famous from earlier in this era, and that is the Melian dialogue, which was this interaction that Athens had with this little city of Melos, which was trying to remain neutral in the Peloponnesian War. And Athens at this point is just this, prideful empire-building civilization, and they're trying to get everybody on their side against Sparta. And they say to Melos, "We're gonna basically raise your city to the ground unless you join us." And why are we going to do that? Not because it's like good in some abstract sense, but because the strong do what they can and the weak suffer what they must. And so this is what Glaucon is proposing, is obviously a view that was on offer at the time. And he says basically that if you could, everybody would do this. So he's trying to work out a proof that justice is just something people do because there are conventions in society that reward it. And that those conventions are basically utilitarian. They're there so that everybody doesn't have to suffer injustice all the time, doesn't have to suffer violence and pain and so forth. And he tells this story, which will be familiar to basically everybody. So let me read the story, and then I'll talk about why it's familiar to everyone. Glaucon says, "The license of which I speak would best be realized if they should come into possession of the sort of power that it is said the ancestor of Gyges the Lydian once got." We've met Gyges the Lydian before in Herodotus. He's part of the Herodotus story about how these different Eastern empires rose and fell. But Plato gives us this different version as a kind of thought experiment. He says, "They say he, that is the ancestor of Gyges, was a shepherd, toiling in the service of the man who was then ruling Lydia. There came to pass a great thunderstorm and an earthquake. The earth cracked and a chasm opened at the place where he was pasturing. He saw it, wondered at it, and went down. He saw, along with other quite wonderful things about which they tell tales, a hollow bronze horse. It had windows. Peeping in, he saw there was a corpse inside that looked larger than human size." This is like a horror story. Plato is such an excellent storyteller, which sometimes gets lost in all the philosophy, right? There's a corpse which looked larger than human size. It had nothing on except a gold ring on its hand. He slipped it off and went out. When there was the usual gathering of shepherds to make the monthly report to the king about the flocks, he too came, wearing the ring. Now, while he was sitting with the others, he chanced to turn the collet of the ring to himself toward the inside of his hand. So he basically turns the ring upside down. When he did this, he became invisible to those sitting by him, and they discussed him as though he were away. He wondered at this, and fingering the ring again, he twisted the collet toward the outside. When he had twisted it, he became visible. Now, why do I say that everybody will recognize this? Well, it's basically the Lord of the Rings, right? This is in some ways the inspiration for the Ring of Power, which when you put it on, you become invisible to everybody except the forces of evil. And the genius of that story, which borrows from the genius of Plato's story, is that when we put the ring on, right, we all know somewhere in our hearts that there would be an enormous temptation to do evil. The consequences are gone. You are basically let loose upon the world. And this is a fabulous critique of justice as a good in itself, because Glaucon knows that we're all going to feel the force of like, well, wouldn't you just do anything that you want? Here's what he says. If there were two such rings, and the just man would put one on and the unjust man the other, no one, as it would seem, would be so adamant as to stick by justice and bring himself to keep away from what belongs to others and not lay hold of it, although he had license to take what he wanted from the market without fear, and to go into houses and have intercourse with whomever he wanted, and to slay or release from bonds whomever he wanted, and to do other things as an equal to a god among humans. And Glaucon basically says you would be a fool, you would be a chump not to take what you could get in that context. And we would just look at somebody who did that and think he was ridiculous. What's great about this is it's so much more subtle and sophisticated than the kind of modern critique of justice that you get from like Darwinian theorists. Now, look, I'm not saying that evolution as itself isn't a useful theory for describing like science, but I am saying that we have this ridiculous idea that comes out of a kind of over application of Darwinian theory to everything, that, well, basically our ideas about morality are they just exist for our own social utility. They evolved in the herd because it was beneficial that we shouldn't cheat one another, we shouldn't attack one another. But really, like, these things are matters of human convention. People always present that as if it's some new discovery. Oh, well, Darwin now shows us, blah, blah, blah. But it's all here. It's all in the Republic. And Glaucon then goes further. He says, well, if you took that convention away, then you wouldn't have the reason anymore. You wouldn't have any reason if nobody was rewarding you, nobody was punishing you. What would your reason be? You would just want to take everything that you can get. I would add myself, from a kind of Christian perspective, right, that what I think I would do if I had the ring of power, right, is I would go invisible and I would instantly want to do all these things that I've always wanted to do that I think would set the world right. I would depose this ruler, and I would, cause this person to take his place or whatever. And I would kill this person that I think is super, super evil. And I would be convinced of my own righteousness in that, right? But of course, I would be inviting my heart to indulge itself bit by bit. And this is the slow, subtle self-deception that we all engage in. Yeah, if I ruled the world, if I could do anything without consequences, I would fix things. But we all know in our hearts, if we really get down to it, that ultimately those desires would reveal themselves to be more and more twisted, more and more disgusting. And if you don't admit that to yourself, then I think you've got some introspection to do. So this is Glaucon's challenge to the idea of justice, the idea that we do justice just for the good of justice, and we should do right and wrong no matter what. And Adeimantus then steps in and kind of adds the theodicy element. He says, look, poets and conventional wisdom tell us certain things about the gods, right? And that's all the information we have is from poets and conventional wisdom. So this is what they say. They say the gods reward justice and they punish injustice. And that's another reason why people think they have to be just, right? Is because they're going to go to Tartarus in the afterlife. Or even in the present, maybe there's some idea that like Zeus gives good to the good people and bad to the evil people. And so Adeimantus has to break that down too and say, even if what if there's no divine retribution for injustice? So here's Adeimantus adding that in. This is, for those of you who are following along in the Stephanus pages, this is 365e. He says, if there are gods and they care, we know of them or have heard of them from nowhere else than the laws and the poets who have given genealogies. And these are the very sources of our being told that they are such as to be persuaded and perverted by sacrifices, soothing vows, and votive offerings. So he quotes all of these famous Greek poets, many of whom we still read today. And he says, there's actually a contradiction here, because it sounds like the gods are kind of corrupt or stupid, like that they can be basically bought off with sacrifices and burnt offerings. And yet we're told that they're just and they punish injustice. It says either both things must be believed or neither. If they are to be believed, injustice must be done and sacrifice offered from the unjust acquisitions. For if we are just, we won't be punished by the gods. That is all. and will refuse the gains of injustice. But if we are unjust, we shall gain and get off unpunished as well by persuading the gods with prayers when we transgress and make mistakes. And then he imagines somebody replying, but in Hades, we'll pay the penalty for our injustices here, either we ourselves or our children's children. But, my dear, will say the man who calculates, the initiations and the delivering gods have great power, as say the greatest cities of those children of gods who have become poets and spokesmen of the gods and reveal that this is the case. So he's saying, look, if injustice is the thing that gets you what you want, you should just do it and then buy the gods off with sacrifice later. Why not, right? And this is now the strongest version of this pro-injustice argument, that if nobody's looking and there are no punishments, right, why wouldn't you just do what you want and get what you want, no matter what the cost, right? The great thing about this is that every utilitarian and evolutionary argument for justice and morality ultimately boils down to this. And they kind of try to decorate it and make it sound pretty by being like, well, we still have to behave in certain ways in society in order to be. But ultimately, right, this is what Glaucon and Adeimantus are stripping away. They're saying, let's say there are no rewards associated with justice. Let's say the way that, Dostoevsky kind of said in Crime and Punishment, let's say that you could do a lot of good by killing somebody in cold blood. Maybe that person is kind of nasty, and maybe you could use the wealth that you get from killing that person to help a lot of people, this utilitarian idea, right? The question is, would that be okay if you never got caught for it? Or is there something irrevocable about the life of a human being? And is that morality objective no matter who rewards you for it, just per se? Is it simply good to be just? So they've gotten now to the core of it, right? They've stripped away everything else. And that's why that passage I read at the beginning is so crucial, is because they say, what if the just man suffered terribly the way that the unjust man is supposed to in society? And this is really, I said that this is a central question for all thinking civilizations, right? This is Plato really pushing up against the limits of what we can intuit without the revelation of Judeo-Christian scripture, right? He's saying like there must be some way to find justice even if you suffer for it. This is why it sounds so much like Jesus, right? And why ultimately, I'm going to talk about this next week, why ultimately Jesus is kind of the final answer to this question. But anyway, right, we've now presented this as starkly as we can in a way that, if we think about it, we've all experienced, because we all know that bad things happen to good people. And we all know also that we see people do terrible things and never get punished for it in this life that we can see. I mean, maybe they experience deep remorse, maybe they're eaten up inside. If we're religious, maybe we believe that they will suffer in the afterlife. But here and now, we watch things like, Dr. Fauci just lying and making a mess of coronavirus, and before that, making a mess of the AIDS crisis, and never, ever getting kicked out of his job, right? Just remaining in power with all this influence and authority, and it like burns us up inside. And yet it happens and we have no control over it. We see this withdrawal in Afghanistan that just happened. It's just absolute disaster, this graveyard of broken promises that Biden and his administration and the military industrial complex that he is basically the head of, this graveyard that they left of our allies out there, and the horrors that they subjected them to, and the mess they made of it, and nobody's stepping down. Nobody's taking accountability, all of these things. They just think they're going to slide right by and get away with it. And you know what? They might. That's the problem that we're facing up to in this book of the Republic and just in life generally, right? We've kind of like boiled it down to the essence of it. So now we turn to Socrates. What's Socrates going to say? If you don't already read The Spectator, let me make this your new favorite publication. I have loved them for a long time because, in our world where discourse is falling apart and being captured by ideology or wokeness or cancel culture, The Spectator is above party, but it does go deeply into politics and a bunch of other stuff too: arts, culture, food, wine, travel, everything you could imagine. If you sign up today, you will get 3 free months of both the print and the digital magazine, plus a free Spectator hat, which will make me super jealous. Use the offer code HERETICS, HERETICS, just like in the title, when you go to spectatorworld.com/special offer. One more time, that's offer code heretics to get writing from really just a who's who of the best names. Some pals of mine whom I respect enormously: Christopher Caldwell, Douglas Murray, Chadwick Moore, and then a bunch of other folks like Roger Scruton, Julie Bindel, Lionel Shriver. All of these people you will love to read. It will be deeply entertaining and thought-provoking no matter what your political affiliation. One more time, use the offer code heretics at spectatorworld.com/special offer. Okay, so after all this, Glaucon and Adeimantus like lay this whole thing at Socrates' feet, and Socrates is kind of like, well, that's a lot, bro. Like, that's a great deal to be dealing with. And in his kind of adorable Socrates way, he says, well, I don't know if I can really help you with this, and it would probably take all night, to work out like what is justice in essence. So that's kind of like a lot. And then and Glaucon and Adeimantus is like, no, help us out. You have to get us out, because they want to be persuaded that this is wrong, right? They're troubled by these arguments, as I believe Plato was, and they want an answer to it that they can rely on. And this is the beginning of the whole project of the Republic proper. Essentially, Socrates makes this big shift that merits our close attention. So I'm going to read to you the shift that Socrates makes to turn the focus away from what Glaucon and Adeimantus have been talking about and to approach the question systematically from the beginning, which is how he's going to do it for the rest of the whole dialogue. Remember that this dialogue is first person from Socrates' perspective. Glaucon and the others begged me in every way to help out and not to give up the argument, but rather to seek out what each is, that is, what justice and injustice are, and the truth about the benefit of both. So I spoke my opinion. It looks to me, says Socrates, as though the investigation we are undertaking is no ordinary thing, but one for a man who sees sharply. Since we're not clever men, I said, in my opinion, we should make this kind of investigation of it. If someone had, for example, ordered men who don't see very sharply to read little letters from afar, and then someone had the thought that the same letters are somewhere else also, but bigger and in a bigger place, I suppose it would look like a godsend to be able to consider the littler ones after having read these first, if, of course, they do happen to be the same. Most certainly, said Adeimantus, but Socrates, what do you notice in the investigation of the just that's like this? I'll tell you, I said, there is, we say, justice of one man, and there is, surely, justice of a whole city too. Certainly, he said. Is a city bigger than one man? Yes, it is bigger, he said. So then, perhaps, there would be more justice in the bigger, and it would be easier to observe closely. Now, this is crucially important, right? This turn, this is the whole dialogue hangs on this. And it's basically the idea, it's very intuitive as a metaphor, right? That if you're trying to see something, you want to blow it up to a really big size so that you can examine it in more detail. It's like zooming in on something, basically. And Socrates says, well, we talk about just people, morally good, virtuous, whatever, just people. And we talk about cities that have justice and that do justice. And the whole thing turns on assuming, right? Socrates says he's assuming that when we use the word justice, we mean the same thing. It's like when I say there's a bronze circle and a wooden circle, right? This word circle refers to that same thing, that shape. And so if I look at them both, I can find out what is common to them. What's the thing that I mean in essence when I say circle? They're going to do the same thing now with justice, assuming that we mean the same thing when we talk about just cities as when we talk about just people. We can examine first what a just city is. And that's what this whole kind of thought experiment is going to be from now on. They embark upon this project of imagining the most just city. And they know, by the way, this is a critique that has been levied forever against the Republic. They know that this is a theory. Machiavelli accused Socrates and Plato indirectly of building cities in their imagination that nobody could ever build in real life. But Plato knew that because he then later wrote a dialogue, The Laws, in which he built the second best city with actual people in it, right? And Immanuel Kant, the philosopher, the Enlightenment philosopher, says, out of the crooked timber of humanity, no straight thing was ever made. But what Plato is doing here through the character of Socrates is he's giving us the theoretical ideal so that we can know, if we agree, where we are striving toward. Maybe we can't get there given the realities of the broken world, but this is the kind of how can we imagine what pure justice or justice in its essence would look like in a city. The way he goes about this is he basically plays a like imaginary game of Age of Empires. If you've ever played this video game, it's this game where like you are building a civilization and your buddies are also building civilizations and they grow and they grow and they grow and then they go to war. And in Age of Empires, it's like you have to do each of the basic things that a civilization is made out of. You have to have farmers who are giving you food. You have to have builders who are making you houses. You have to do all these things. That's essentially exactly what Socrates begins by doing. And his basic idea, right, is that we form societies because we aren't totally self-sufficient and we work best when we're in relationship with one another. Because he says the sort of basic theoretical city is just 4 or 5 men, one to make the food, one to make houses, one to make clothes, and one to make shoes and deal with care of the body. And he says, if one person has to do all of these things, he's not going to do any of them very well. He might not be able to do some of them at all. And so people enter into contracts with one another so that one person can focus upon, expert food making, another person upon expert clothing making. And that creates the most excellent version of this kind of basic level city. This is Socrates' version of the social contract. It's totally different from the Glaucon version where we enter into society to protect one another from doing injustice to each other. We enter into society because it maximizes our productivity and our efficiency, right? And it maximizes the way that we are best in operation is in relationship with one another. Now, this goes on for a little while, right? There's sort of imagine different things that people might do in this city, and it grows and grows until you have all of the basic needs met, essentially. People doing all these different things, and you're slowly starting to get to this idea, which will become crystallized as we go on, of suum cuique, which is a Latin tag meaning to each his own. It's kind of a bigger idea than just getting what you're owed. It's each person gets the thing that is appropriate to him. So if I commit a murder, what penalty am I owed? Or if I do work, right, what wages am I owed? And all of this is like each person doing the thing that is right for him and getting the thing that is right for him. We eventually kind of get to a point where this Age of Empires civilization building is kind of complete theoretically. And then Glaucon breaks in and he says, well, this is like a city for pigs. It's just like they just, meet their basic needs and they don't do any of the stuff of life. I mean, come on, you got to have like dancing and delicacies and all this stuff. Let's read Glaucon's objection. So Glaucon says, I suppose men who aren't going to be wretched recline on couches and eat from tables and have relishes and desserts just like men have nowadays. All right, I said, this is Socrates, right? I understand. We are, as it seems, considering not only how a city, but also a luxurious city comes into being. Perhaps that's not bad either. For in considering such a city too, we could probably see in what way justice and injustice naturally grow in cities. Now, the true city is, in my opinion, the one we just described, a healthy city, as it were. But if you want to, let's look at a feverish city too. Nothing stands in the way. For these things, as it seems, won't satisfy some or this way of life. But couches, tables, and other furniture will be added, and of course, relishes, perfume, incense, courtesans, and cakes, all sorts of all of them. And in particular, we can't still postulate the mere necessities we were talking about at first, houses, clothes, and shoes, but painting and embroidery must also be set in motion. Gold, ivory, and everything of the sort must be obtained. Is that so? Yes, says Glaucon. Then, says Socrates, the city must be made bigger again. This healthy one isn't adequate anymore, but must already be gorged with a bulky mass of things which are not in cities because of necessity. All the hunters and imitators, many concerned with figures and colors, many with music and poets and their helpers, rhapsodes, actors, choral dancers, contractors and craftsmen of all sorts of equipment for feminine adornment, as well as other things. So he's saying, okay, in pure theory, we've built the ideal city. It's self-sufficient. Everybody's needs are met. Everybody has a job to do. But we are actually going beyond pure theory now. We're going to kind of humanize this city and give it these luxuries, which Socrates is sort of disdainful of. Well, what's that going to mean? It's going to mean that your city's getting bigger because you're bringing people in to do all of these other things. Your city gets bigger, it has more appetites, and it needs more land. Other cities are probably also doing the same thing. So what's going to happen next? You're going to go to war. And this is where we get the need for a warrior class. One of the things that we know from talking about manhood on this show is that if you have warriors in your civilization who only fight, who only have aggression, or what Plato would call thumos, that is this courage and spiritedness, then they're actually brutes. They're not full men. They're barbarians and savages, and they just destroy. They don't build up, right? And so what we actually need to do is we need to have a class that is courageous and spirited, but also gentle and kind when it comes to the citizens of the city itself. And Socrates rather charmingly compares them to dogs, right? He says dogs love their owners and the people they know, but then they're super aggressive against people from outside. So this is what the warrior class should be like. And then he says, and this is I'm reading now from this part. The disposition of noble dogs is to be as gentle as can be with their familiars and people they know, and the opposite with those they don't know. I do know that. Then I said, it is possible, after all, and what we're seeking for in the guardian isn't against nature. In your opinion, does the man who will be a fit guardian need, in addition to spiritedness, also to be a philosopher in his nature? How's that? He said, I don't understand. This too you'll observe in dogs, I said, and it's a thing in the beast worthy of our wonder. What? When it sees someone it doesn't know, it's angry, although it never had any bad experience with him. And when it sees someone it knows, it greets him warmly, even if it never had a good experience with him. Didn't you ever wonder about this before? No, I haven't paid much attention. Well, this does look like an attractive affection of its nature and truly philosophic, in that it distinguishes friendly from hostile looks by nothing other than having learned the one and being ignorant of the other. And so, how can it be anything other than a lover of learning, since it defines what's its own and what's alien by knowledge and ignorance? Now, this is kind of a tongue in cheek argument. Dog lovers will obviously be fans of it because we do know, of course, that noble dogs do behave this way, right? But it's probably a stretch to call them philosophers. But there's a serious point behind it, right? And that is that these guardians of the city are going to need to know to have a very subtle and powerful way to discern good from evil and to know the truth, right? So that they can wield the power and the courage and the spiritedness that they have. This is something, guardians in the Republic can be both men and women, but we have talked about how this is particularly important for men because you have all of this desire to go out and do things and fight, right, for a cause, but you need also to temper that, right, with love and most of all, in Socrates' view, with philosophy, with love of the good, with knowledge of the good. Now, you can probably tell that I'm building my way gradually from the ground up to this very, very famous concept. And because it's such a famous concept, it can be hard to get a fresh look at. But this is the concept of the philosopher kings, right? Here's the first thing to be aware of. When Plato starts talking about philosopher kings, that is, people who will have power in the city, who will be lovers of knowledge and wisdom and have power to rule in the city, he's not actually talking about like rule by college professors. He's not talking about rule by academic. That's something that we can get confused about because we do, in fact, in our modern America and in the modern West, we have this sort of elite class of people who think that doing philosophy is just being a man without a chest, right? Kind of abstracting in your ivory tower and telling the plebs what to do, those, dirty middle Americans or whatever. And I'm being, I'm caricaturing a little bit, but not by too terribly much, right? We do have this idea of like rule by expert and academic. That's not what the philosopher kings are. Remember that they're primarily warriors. They're primarily what is called in Greek phylakes, or guardians. And they are then, because they're warriors, they need to train in philosophy. It's a totally different idea about philosophy than we have. The philosophy and love of the good as the way to direct the kind of stuff of life, the passion and the energy and the courage. So they have to be trained, to be educated. And the next part of this book, which is then going to be a major preoccupation of the whole dialogue, is the education of these philosopher kings, right? How are we going to teach them? How are we going to mold their souls? My dudes, you have got to get your beard game on point, and the place to do that is Mini Mustachery. Even if you're not like me and you do not want your face to be covered by a luscious beard, you still need to pay attention to your grooming. This is a lost masculine art. You got to shave and make sure you're not scraggly and gross. Mini Mustachery is the one-stop shop to do everything you could possibly need. They have beard brushes and combs. They have oils and waxes and all this great stuff, plus beautiful razors that you can use to get an extremely close shave. I have particularly been enjoying some of their new shampoos, which are really great for just like getting the whatever leftover food or stuff that gets caught in your beard. I use their stuff for basically everything that I do to my face. And there, there's a lot of kind of one trick ponies and weird folks that you can find by scrolling social media or whatever. Don't bother with any of that. Just get the good stuff. Go to minimustachery.com/heretics, minimustachery.com/heretics to get 25% off your purchase with the offer code heretics at checkout, just like in the title. Go fix your face, boys. So this is where we get something that we've talked about before when we've talked about education, which is Plato's view and a sort of widespread Greek view that there are two basic parts to a good childhood education. One is gymnastike, which literally means stuff you do naked, but it's physical training. And gymnastike is training for the body, so wrestling and training with weaponry and all that stuff. Then you have moustakhe, which is training for the soul. And usually this is translated as music. It's really everything that the muses preside over. So not just songs, but poems and history and stories, all kinds of literature, right? Moustakhe, music, is for the soul. And it's a totally lost way of looking at education that is actually the right and the true way. Because what do you do when you raise a child up? Inevitably, what you are doing is you're shaping the soul. You're teaching him not just facts and figures, but what's good, right? You teach them morals and how to do good and what is wrong, right? And there's no such thing as not teaching a child morals. There's just teaching a child good morals and bad morals. And Socrates is basically just saying we're shaping the soul we're trying to find music and poetry and art that is going to shape the soul in a good way. When you tell these fables and fairy tales to kids in school, when you sing them songs and nursery rhymes, you want them to be shaped to love the good and not to love evil things. This is why it is such a disaster when our elites kind of insert their crazy critical race theory or leftism or wokeness into early childhood education, because you're basically giving them a false idea about how the world works. When you have a false idea about how the world works, it's very difficult to get it out of your brain if it's instilled in you early on. So if you teach kids there are like 57 genders, and if you teach them that, Black people are inherently better than white people and white people are inherently guilty and all of these things, right? They're going to go out into the world and have a false theory about how the world works. It's going to be very, very difficult to get out of their souls. And so this is why you see all these young people going out and doing things that make them miserable and not being able to figure out why they make them miserable, not being able to stop, right? If you've ever seen the movie, what's it called? Oh, Kung Pao, right? Which is the movie where they dub over a bunch of old kung fu movie footage to make a comedy out of it. There's a character in Kung Pao called Wimp Lo, and Wimp Lo has been trained wrong so that he thinks that he wins a fight if he gets punched in the face or kicked in the groin. He's always like getting the crap kicked out of him. And then he'll say like, oh, try my face to your fist style, right? And then the teacher comes up and he says, that is Wimp Lo. We trained him wrong as a joke, And this is what, in a tragic, kind of tragicomic way, like this is what our elites currently do to children. They shape them with these ideas about the world that necessarily imply that they should want some things and not want others, right? That they shouldn't want to be traditionally masculine, or, girls shouldn't want to stay at home. And this creates this like alienation from the self. And so basically what Socrates is saying here is that if we're going to have these people who are going to lead at the end of the day, and if we're going to have them, fight on our behalf and make laws and all this stuff, we need to train them in a way that sees the world truly and rightly and well. And so this is why we get something that Plato has been criticized for centuries, which is his very careful, almost totalitarian watch over what kind of stories and myths and poems can be spread and told in this Callipolis, the beautiful city, the perfect city that they're imagining. Now, a couple things before. I'm going to, later on when we do future books, I'm going to defend Plato a little bit more, but also critique him in some ways on this topic, right? It's a big subject, and we're going to keep doing it throughout the books. A few preliminary things. Leave aside for a moment the question how the elites or the guardians or whatever you want to call them are going to be chosen, right? Because that's a question of what kind of regime do you have? Do you have an oligarchy? Do you vote for your leaders? Whatever. Whatever kind of regime you choose, there are going to be people who have certain gifts. And it will be to the benefit of the political community to train those gifts up in a way that does not make them like wimp low. That is, that doesn't make them see the world in a way that causes them to continually fail, as our elites are currently doing in Afghanistan and at home and all this stuff, right? But rather that trains them and shapes them. It's incredibly important to train and shape your elites so that when they become leaders, they can lead in virtuous and effective ways. That is what Plato is concerned with here, right? Sometimes we get particularly angry at Plato because he kicks all the great poets out. You know, he kicks Homer out, he kicks Hesiod out, all these wonderful stories, right? But you have to remember that his focus is specifically on something very important. He's on what kind of stories and myths are we going to tell to children at the expense of the state so that those children can then grow up and become effective guardians. No matter what kind of regime you have, that is a problem that you are going to have to deal with. No matter what kind of political community you form, there will be elites and they will rise to the tops of their respective field, and you had better shape their souls in ways that accurately reflect the reality of the world. Having said all of that, let me read then what Plato, via Socrates, wants these elites, these guardians, to be taught. He says, above all, it mustn't be said that gods make war on gods and plot against them and have battles with them, for it isn't even true, provided that those who are going to guard the city for us must consider it most shameful to be easily angry with one another. They are far from needing to have tales told and embroideries woven about battles of giants and the many diverse disputes of gods and heroes with their families and kin. But if we are somehow going to persuade them that no citizen ever was angry with another, and that to be so is not holy, it's just such things that must be told to the children right away by old men and women. As they get older, the poets must be compelled to make up speeches for them which are close to these. But Hera's bindings by her son, and Hephaestus being cast out by his father when he was about to help out his mother who was being beaten, and all the battles of the gods Homer made must not be accepted in the city, whether they are made with a hidden sense or without a hidden sense. That is, whether they're kind of told allegorically or just literally. A young thing can't judge what is hidden sense and what is not, but what he takes into his opinions at that age has a tendency to become hard to eradicate and unchangeable. That's what he's saying. He's saying these are impressionable kids and incredibly important resources because they will grow up to lead the city. Now, Plato, via Socrates, is certainly in excess here, and there are kind of creepy totalitarian vibes around the edges of this because it's pure theory, and pure theory always, right, has this perfect way to own and operate the world. And then when you actually get into it, it's like, this kind of sounds terrible. You're going to kick Homer out of your city, right? But the question that he's raising and the approach to it that he's advocating is absolutely the right one, right? I mean, this is the thing. I know that our elites currently are a disaster, but the reality of elites is forever, right? And teaching and training those elites is a matter of intense concern, and it is a matter of what stories we tell our kids, which, by the way, is a very different question than what stories we allow into the city writ large, right? He says when you teach those kids at their impressionable age, you can't take it back very easily. One last thing, very important, very subtle thing, which if you blink, you miss it. Socrates has totally flipped the script on Glaucon and especially Adeimantus. Adeimantus was saying, well, poets tell us about gods and that they do this and that. And from this, can we infer that the universe is like this? That the universe actually doesn't care about injustice and justice. Socrates has now gotten around in the space of one book to approaching the question from exactly the opposite way. He's saying, no, no, no. We actually do have another source of knowledge about God, because he's very skeptical, it seems, of the idea that multiple gods, might fight from different vantage points, right? We actually do have a way to get to know the divine, and that is by looking at the good in the world, right, and reasoning about it and saying gods therefore must be like this. We should tell these stories about gods this way because of what we discern as good and true in the world. When we look at a just city, when we look at a city that functions well, we come to know a little bit about justice, and we should apply and ascribe those qualities in totality to God, right? This is a very, very different way of approaching the world. And it's actually not the only way that you can do it. We're going to talk next week about a book of the Bible, the book of Job, which approaches this question from a much more kind of empirical standpoint, which is to say, like, well, the world is not a world of perfect justice. It's a world of fallenness and brokenness. So how do we reckon with God on that basis? Which is different from saying, well, God is good and just, and this is what good and justice are in their pure abstract forms. So that's what God must be like. Two distinct approaches that in some ways mirror, right, these two pillars of the West, Athens and Jerusalem, right, this empirical, like, felt sense of how the world is versus this theoretical sense of what our logic tells us should be so. And meeting those two things in the middle is kind of the whole project of the West. Okay, that's Republic Book 2. We will continue through this book, although not next week. By now, I am sure you know that my good friend Liz Wheeler has her own show, The Liz Wheeler Show. And the reason I'm sure you know that is because you do not live under a rock. This thing has absolutely taken off. I've loved to see it. Liz is a truth teller and a fighter. Every episode has deeply researched arguments and just things that nobody else will say. When I watch the hate that Liz gets online, I think, man, like, this girl is telling it like it is, and she really will not back down for anybody. If you like this show, which I know you do because it's amazing, you will love The Liz Wheeler Show. It's produced by the same people, by my friends at Soundfront, who do fantastic work. They do not only The Liz Wheeler Show and Young Heretics, but also Verdict with Ted Cruz. So go to lizwheelershow.com, subscribe wherever you get your podcasts, leave a 5-star review, and most importantly, tell Liz that I sent you. Mailbag questions come to me on Locals. If you haven't gotten on Locals yet, I really warmly invite you to do so. It's an amazing platform. It's run by my pal, Dave Rubin, who's a staunch defender of free speech. And so I created the Young Heretics community at youngheretics.com/locals, where if you become a VIP, you can go deeper with me into all the questions that we raise here on the show and how to apply these principles into our real life. VIPs get episodes a week in advance, but we also get Q&As, and I write exclusive essays and we discuss. So really, I am blessed by the Young Heretics VIPs. I'm grateful to be leading that community. And if you are in it, then you can be in the mailbag. So here's a question from Elizabeth. Mailbag question. I really like this question. I just started reading the Canterbury Tales. The introduction in this edition notes that most of the stories would have been familiar to Chaucer's audience at the time. This fascinates me because, one, so far they are all new to me, and two, I don't think we tell each other's stories this way anymore. We don't have to. We have books and TV and movies to tell the stories for us. It's also interesting to think about which stories are more or less universally known in our culture. My question is this. In the hypothetical situation where the EMP has gone off and we don't have access to our libraries, what are the two stories you would pick to tell and retell around the campfire or walking along the road? Well, this is a really good question, and it's more than just a hypothetical, I think, because, we have this idea that our enormous archives are just fingertip reach to everything that's ever been written down and recorded and preserved, right? That digital technology allows us this incredible access. And we think that that means that we don't have to, like, really read or know the stuff because it's just out there for us to access. First of all, I think that it's kind of all built on air. Like, it would be really easy for sort of Library of Alexandria event to occur, it seems to me. But more importantly than that, right? Plato already worried about this when writing came along. He said people are just going to outsource their memory to this new technology of writing, right? They're just going to write things down and then they won't have to memorize them. And as I say again and again, right, memorizing something gets it into the furniture of your soul. It like cuts this groove in your heart and in your mind. And now you have ownership over it so that it can shape you and it occurs to you at different moments, right? If you memorize a psalm and then a line from it occurs to you at just the moment, it's a much different experience than if you happen to know that the Psalms are available like on whatever, BibleGateway.com. This is because, right, in order to shape the soul, the way I was talking about with education, you actually have to take ownership of this stuff. And it's why, by the way, the Hebrew Bible says again and again, right, tell these stories to your children, bind them to your body, right, set them as a seal upon you and put them on your doorway and all of this stuff, right? It's this like incorporation of it into your soul that no machine, no matter how advanced, can ever do, right? The computer doesn't have a soul. The computer's not like reading the Psalms and being changed by it and spiritually transformed and having that experience that you can have, right? It's worthless in the computer unless the computer enables you and helps you to be part of this ongoing tradition of keeping stories in your heart, passing them on from generation to generation. My answer to your main question is probably a little bit boring because the two stories that I would tell are the story of the Exodus from Egypt, God's ransom, his liberation of the people of Israel from Egypt, and the story of the crucifixion. In some sense, these are the same story, mirrored in two different ways. One's in the history of a people, one's in the life of a single man for all mankind, for all humanity. I believe that if you really internalize the deep mystery of these stories, you could spin out from them to everything else that we talk about on this show. And I know that, one half of the West is not, at least is not the Judeo-Christian tradition, is the pagan classical tradition. But I've insisted again and again on this show that even the greats of the pagan traditions were already kind of coming up on as much of this insight as you could generate without the special revelation of the Hebrew Bible and Jesus Christ. So these are the two stories that I think kind of contain everything and are constantly prefigured or repeated in other stories. And this is an argument that like Chesterton makes in The Everlasting Man and C.S. Lewis and Tolkien, they all had this kind of idea. It's a pretty Christocentric idea, but you asked me for my picks and those are mine. So I hope that helps. Thank you for this wonderful question. And I will see you on Locals. One more time, if you want to join us on Locals, go to youngheretics.com/locals. That's it from me for now. It's such a pleasure to do this show. Thank you for listening. If you like it, if you like the show, and come on, it's amazing, right? You know you like it. Go to claremont.org. Check out the Claremont Review of Books and the American Mind. This is where I work. It's a center for the recovery of the American idea, a goal that I believe in now more than ever. If you would like to help support us, go to claremont.org/donate and let them know in the notes that you heard about Claremont through Young Heretics. All right, folks, I will see you next week for more truth, beauty, and the stuff that matters.